Thank you and good morning everyone, and welcome to the week of the 2nd of December and the hearings that we have this week in relation to heritage and notable trees today and Thursday and Friday, McNab and sites and areas of significance to Maori. This week we have the full panel here with us. Maria Bartlett, the far right, Glenys Dixon to my right, Cliff Bolger to my left, and Keith Ovell, who will be chairing this week. So we'll turn to heritage, and we have the two Section 42A planners with us. And we will be first dealing with the historic heritage and then secondly with the notable trees. So Joanne Scoos, who was the author of the 42A on historic.
No, sorry, Tina.
Oh, Tina was, yes. Yes, okay. So have we got Tina online or?
Yeah, she's just
Okay. Who's the author of the 42A on historic? Oh, Tina. So good morning to Tina and Brad and Anne McEwen, who's online. So if the three online didn't hear my comments a moment ago, we'll be dealing with the historic heritage first, and then for the 42A report, and then turning to trees. So good morning, Brad, in terms of the tree material, and Anne in terms of the heritage. Our only constraint is that the first of the speakers is turning up at 11 o'clock, and hopefully we'll get through the two Section 42A reports prior to then. So Tina, we've got your 42A report and some supplementary material. I think the supplementary material provided just a summary of the evidence that has been presented. I don't think there was anything new in there, is that correct?
We haven't got a speaker.
No, it should be, it's coming through the roof, so we should be fine. Brad, can you hear us? No? Anne can't hear us either? We're coming through the roof, so we should be fine. Shouldn't need that. Sorry, Brad, can you hear us?
I can hear you now, thank you.
All right, so I'll repeat what I was saying a couple of moments ago. We didn't have the right button pushed. So this morning we will be dealing with historic heritage first, and then the notable trees. So good morning to all three that are online. We've got Tina, Brad and Anne. Turning first then to the historic heritage. Tina, we've got your Section 42A report. We've also got a supplementary report that appeared to just be a summary of the evidence presented. Was there anything new in it?
Yes, that's correct. So the supplementary evidence only related to two submitters that provided supplementary evidence, really. It's Transpower and the telecommunications companies.
So there was no new evidence from you in there, it was just a summary?
That's right. Heritage New Zealand, its evidence was tabled on Friday, but they're in general agreement with the recommendations in Section 42, so there wasn't much to respond to there.
All righty. So we'll take the 42A as read, and I'll open it up for questions from the panel.
I had a couple of questions that I was starting with your supplementary evidence and I know that they're matters covered in your Section 42A, but they were focused on those things that were of concern to Transpower and the telcos. So at your paragraph 17 of your supplementary, what I'm trying to understand is whether HHR5, once you hit restricted discretionary status, that might be therefore dealing with something new coming to the site as opposed to existing infrastructure. Is that the right way to read HHR5?
Yes, so it's the intention is to try and allow for some land use and development that are low risk, and so if there's existing infrastructure, it's trying to allow for those things to be maintained, but if there's anything outside of that that requires additional land disturbance and any new infrastructure, that would then get triggered into a restricted discretionary consent.
Okay, great, because that's how I read it as well. But then when I looked to the policy's not speaking to anything new. And so I may be reading that differently to you. So if you could just make that connection in HHP 7 and how we would make use of that policy if something new were to be heading down that restricted discretionary path.
Yes. Okay, so sorry, I need to go up to P7. Yes, so the policy direction would be then that that you are managing these activities to ensure that the proposal complies with 1, 2, 3 and 4, or is compatible with the historic heritage values, undertaken in a sensitive manner, and protects the heritage and archaeological values, and is undertaken in accordance with best practice conservation principles, and will contribute to the long-term viability and retention of the site. So that's the policy direction.
Yes, so I could see that too, that 1 to 4 looked like they would usefully apply to something new coming to the site. But when I look at the entry string to get to 1 to 4, it's really focused on maintenance and repair of existing infrastructure and above ground network utilities, and so that to me would seem potentially we might have a gap if the infrastructure is heading down the restricted discretionary route. It is something new that is coming into an archaeological, a known area, and whether that entry string, while I can see what it's doing, it's trying to show that maintenance and repair is going to be allowed through the permitted pathway. Yes. So I'm wondering if we need some sort of distinction in here around the permitted pathway and the consenting pathway at the policy level.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah, so that should probably read structured to put what we're allowing for and what's managed. Is that more clear? Is that
I think that would respond to some of the material that's come from Transpower and the telcos, although this is something that I want to ask them about a bit further. It's just that I could see that if you end up in the restricted discretionary route and you've got something new and it's infrastructure, the policy won't necessarily be quite doing what you need it to do, potentially.
Yeah. We can certainly relook at
have you finished on those provisions? Because I've got questions on that policy and rule as well. Let me ask while you're looking. Can you explain to me what the difference is, please, between limited land disturbance and earthworks?
Limited land disturbance, well, land disturbance is disturbing the land where you're not permanently altering the contour of it. The limited land disturbance is a reference back to the rule framework, which is allowing for, it has a permitted land disturbance element to it. So instead of specifying in the policy what those limited land activities are, they're set out in the rule. So it's animal grazing is one of them, and the other one is the maintenance and repair of existing infrastructure. So that is really the limited land disturbance allowed for.
When I look up the definitions, I didn't believe, and it's elsewhere in the report, I haven't got the reference here yet, I didn't believe that stock was deemed to be land disturbance. So the
I suppose they, if stock grazing, I suppose they could cause land disturbance by walking on the land, basically. Stock grazing, I suppose, could be viewed as a land use activity more than a land disturbance activity, but the animals could cause a minor sort of a land disturbance.
Now, the words limited land disturbance and changes to existing structures are all within the one comma at beginning, comma at end. Therefore, the way you read that is it must be limited land disturbance plus changes to existing structures. Is that your intent, or should there be a comma after limited land disturbance?
Yes, you're probably right. Yeah, it's yes, I'm trying to cover a lot of ground in that sentence, am I? But yes, no, it's trying to better reflect what is in the rule. In limited land disturbance is separate to the changes to the existing structures. That's correct.
Yeah, so it's rule HHR 5 that talks about land disturbance. And if we look at the archaeological report that was done, and I'll come back to it, that talked about defining what that is. The other thing with Rule R5, demolition, removal, alteration of a structure is permitted where it doesn't predate. There is no change to the size, location or design of the structure's foundation or building footprint. Well, if you're demolishing a building, clearly you're altering the footprint. If you're removing a building, you're altering the footprint. Is that the intent?
So I can just come back to...
So Rule 5, 1B3.
Yes, absolutely. So, there is no change to the size and location of the sign or structure. Yes, if you're removing something, I suppose there is a change to the size in that it's becoming, that the size is decreasing. The B3, the intention of that is more about expansion rather than decrease.
So to avoid confusion, do we need to look at rewording that rule?
Yep.
Sorry, when you said expansion, did you mean alteration? Because
yes, so no change to the size, location of the sign. That is so that it doesn't become any larger or is creating more of a disturbance, rather than, of course, if you're removing a structure, there is a change in the size and location because it's being removed. So no, the intention of 3 is more about alterations that would make a building bigger.
Yes, so the conversation you just had around the definition of land disturbance, when we look at the earthworks definition from the National Planning Standards, it includes land disturbance. And so I had a basic question whether because of that the earthworks chapter should be picking up this disturbance element to be consistent with the National Planning Standards. So that whole question around where earthworks is managed, and the National Planning Standards seem to tell us that should be managed in the earthworks chapter or EIT. They seem to be the 2 options. And so then I thought if that was the case, then this would be dealing with other aspects.
Yes, so if so that is the minute. I haven't responded to the minute that came from the previous hearing stream, and so I'll be looking into that more about having all the earthworks rules in the earthworks chapter. I mean, land disturbance, you can't do earthworks without disturbing the land, of course, and land disturbance is a lesser in that sense. So yes, if we did take that out, then that would sit in the earthworks chapter. It's just about making sure that those connections are very clear, because both the heritage rule that relates to the setting and the archaeological sites rules do also relate to disturbance of the ground. So they're not as clear-cut as only dealing with that element. So as part of responding to the minute from the earthworks chapter, I will be giving that my full attention. I had noted though that similar rules to these are typically located in the historic heritage chapter, but I haven't had a chance yet to review the National Planning Standards in detail and respond to the minute, but I will do so.
Thank you. And it might be those newer plans and how they've dealt with this, I guess, given the age of the National Planning Standards. Yeah.
Yes.
And one other thing I wanted to ask was, this policy P7, is it only dealing with known archaeological sites, or is it intended to apply if an archaeological site is uncovered?
It's only really intent to be in relation to scheduled archaeological sites. Unknown archaeological sites have their own protection through the Accidental Discovery Protocol. So it's the heritage chapter is only in relation to sites and items that have been recommended to be scheduled, and not all sites necessarily.
Those were the things that came out of the supplementary for me, and otherwise I've got questions from the Section 42A.
Yes, sure.
So we'll start on the 42A then. I've got nothing. Mine first comes up at page 18. Have you got anything up to the? Let's go through it bit by bit.
I've gone by paragraph number, so my
Paragraph 58.
Mine's 53 is my first one. So when I read your paragraph 53, I wondered if in actual fact, you were describing an acceptance in part. I think you described it as a rejection, but in reading it, it seemed perhaps as if it was an acceptance in part.
So this, this is paragraph 53?
Yes.
Yes, okay, so this is general support.
Yeah, I think we just worked out the answer to that. Given that you say generally retained, then it's an acceptance in part, not a full acceptance.
Oh, okay, yes. So, I mean, there are obviously some changes, but general intent remains, which is why I think I have said I am accepting that.
I think I was thinking about Mr. Weir's, so yeah, that'll do.
Paragraph 54 talks about the archaeological alert layer, and Anne, if you've got any comments, speak up as well, please. Someone will tell me if you lift your hand up. In the middle there, it talks about the spatial layer is consistent with information provided by Heritage New Zealand and has no rules attached, but may need completion in relation to Maori archaeological information and sites. So are you suggesting that, in fact, the alert layer should show some sites important to the mana whenua?
Yes, so the archaeological alert layer is the spatial layer was prepared by Heritage New Zealand, but when they provided it to us, they specifically said, you know, that there might be cultural significant sites that are not included, and suggested we work with mana whenua. So we initially did some investigation around that with help of our Chris Jennings, who's the archaeologist, and in particular we looked at the historic village of Tutura, and that could be potentially quite a significant site, but we don't have enough records that where this site is, but we didn't feel confident to actually spatially identify this area. So that was never included as part of the map layer, and as you will see in the 42A, he is recommending potentially that the Matara Falls and Tutura are taken out of the schedule, because they were already protected in that sense. And part of my recommendation is that if they were to be removed from the archaeological site schedule, that would potentially leave them unprotected, and these are sites that we know are there is records of historic occupation of these sites, so there is a potential that it could be finds in those areas. So if they wouldn't be in the schedule, then they potentially should be included in the archaeological alert layer instead. But that is a conversation that needs to be had together with mana whenua.
How do we find the alert layer information? Because when I look at the online version of the plan and tick on that box to show the alert layer, nothing shows up.
Sorry, the alert layer, it doesn't show up?
No, it doesn't. Not on the copy that's available online.
Okay, I've had a look at it in the past, and it does come up. It's quite a broad brush layer, so it's areas where there is known to be, you know, activity, like the settlements are covered, for example.
Okay, so the way, yeah.
But it's a broad.
Yep. So what I might get you to do is to work in with the planners, and when we reconvene at 1 o'clock, if someone can actually take us through and show us online, please, an example. Maybe it's a mail thing, or maybe we're not going about it the right way. At some point, we need to have a discussion with both yourself and Chris Jennings over his recommendations on the Mataura Falls and the like, and I think Maria will leave that conversation to 1 o'clock when we've got Chris coming up online. Is that okay?
Yeah. So I just clicked on the information only layer and I can't see anything come up. So again, I'm probably in the same camp as Commissioner Hurrell.
When I had a look at it online through the council portal before, so I'd have to have a look again to see if it's been disabled for some reason or anything like that, but it certainly was there.
Okay.
I have probably one other question, and you can tell me if this is better for Dr. Jennings, but, or I don't know if it is doctor, but anyway, this afternoon. Have there been any discussions with Hokanui about the development or further development of that alert layer? Which was...
Not yet, no. Yeah, we know these are sites that have records of historical occupation, but yeah, no, I haven't had a chance to have any in detail discussions with them about the protection of them yet.
And the other question I had was, I think we've covered information layers previously in the hearing, but I just want to double check. If the information in the alert layer changes, would that require a plan change?
No, that is the advantage of having an information layer outside of the plan, is that it can be updated without a plan change.
But if you're clicking on something that shows up on the district plan maps, by definition, isn't it part of the plan?
That is why it's under, it's got its own heading with information only layers. There's a number of layers under there. Sorry, I can try and get into the layer while talking counter two things at one time.
Yeah. No, we'll come back to the layers. We'll come back to the layers at 1 o'clock, rather, so that we can look at something as well, please.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a number of information layers included with the district plan that's meant to be just for informative purposes, and that might be helpful to plan users. That was the intention with the information on the layers, and we thought that it's sufficiently clear that that they're not part of the plan. So we got like services, for example, reticulated services we can click on and they can come up. That might help you if you're doing land use and development. Archaeological alert, there's electricity lines, and yeah, there's some hazard information as well, for example.
My next one's at 58.
And my next one's 57, and it is just to check whether you're signalling there that you recommend the hyperlink approach more generally. Like, is that actually a preference or a recommendation of yours to adopt that?
Sorry, I didn't quite hear you.
So at your paragraph 57, you're talking about the hyperlink through to the Act. You know, HNZPT have asked for that, and I thought I might have been picking up that you were favouring or recommending that this hyperlink approach would be valuable for other acts referenced in the plan.
Yes, that's
At paragraph 58, you include note 2, and about 5 lines down, just underneath the sentence that starts, if there is reasonable cause to suspect any works, an archaeological assessment should be undertaken. Who should be doing that? Who should be paying for it?
The archaeological assessment. So this is referring back to the Heritage New Zealand Act, and this is, I believe it's taken word for word from that. So the archaeological assessment would be submitted for an archaeological authority, and it's by the person who is wanting to modify the site.
Do you need an archaeological authority if there might be something there, or only if there is?
That might be more of a question for Heritage New Zealand when they come on, but I believe that you have an obligation, even if there isn't a recorded site, if there is reasonable cause to suspect that there could be archaeological findings, that you're meant to undertake an assessment.
My next one, 79. And you are signalling here that while you're supportive of the amendment requested by Hokonui Runanga, you're expressing some concern about it having a limiting effect. So I just wanted to ask, were you saying this because you were thinking of water bodies within the Gore district that are not tributaries of the Mataora River, and what
Yes.
were you thinking of in particular to help me understand your concern?
That potentially there could be Mahinga Kai sites that it didn't necessarily relate to Mataora River and tributaries. It is, it is limiting the scope to only that. But if that is the only Mahinga Kai sites that are of concern to Mana Whenua, then of course, we should accept that change. I just note that it does provide a more narrow scope for consideration.
And so perhaps, although we don't have Hokonui Runanga here to talk to today, we will be talking with them later in the week. So I guess we can just check.
Clarify with them if there are any other ones. Yeah, just to be sure.
Have you checked at all and asked that question?
I haven't checked in with them, no.
At your paragraph 80, you're discussing the advice from Dr. McEwen, and so this might be a great time to put this question to Dr. McEwen around the painting. So you've indicated that the advice was a change in paint colour without permanent effect is not too much of a concern. But I did wonder, whilst it's not permanent, during the time the building is painted differently, won't that affect how it's perceived, and isn't it better to retain existing colouring? And so Dr. McEwen might want to respond to that one.
Thank you. Good morning. Certainly paint colour can change the appearance of a building. There's no question about that. I guess one of the issues with looking at new painting is that there's a question in my mind as to how you establish the historic nature of the paint that's there already. So, you're talking about a conservation process that would do paint scrapings to get down to original paint finishes, that would have to look at when the building was last painted, look at historic records and so on. So that's quite an exhaustive and potentially expensive process. It would be appropriate in the case that you have a conservation plan for a building. So if a conservation plan is prepared either because perhaps it's required by Heritage New Zealand in order to satisfy their concerns for alterations, additions and so on, or if one's been prepared by an owner in order to secure funding from entities like lotteries, their heritage fund. In that case, you might have the evidence, but in the absence of evidence, a paint colour on top of an existing paint that is going to last 10 to 15 years is a fairly minor impact, and I don't think that it's worth, if you like, putting in planning provisions for paint when what you really want to encourage owners to do is maintain and upkeep their buildings and to keep them painted, keep them weather tight, keep their fabric sound. So it's looking at that in the round, really.
And if I can just add that the council does offer a service to building owners in terms of appropriate colours of buildings. We had a shop in the main street that was painted a rather bright colour, and after discussions with council staff, it was painted the colours that it is now, which gave rise to the thought that maybe in some areas we should be looking at colour controls of buildings, but the informal approach seems to have worked okay, and as a result, it doesn't look as though there's anything in the plan that manages colour.
And that was part of what I was thinking as well, that people would be accustomed to the most recent look of a building, and without any colour controls, you could end up with all kinds of representations. But it was really helpful to have your analysis and better understand where you were coming from. And really, I took from that it's that path of a more concerted conservation plan where this would come up, and otherwise it's about weather tightness and enabling longevity and use of the building.
And if I might add one other thing, I think where paint colour can also come into play is if the council is either offering or supporting an owner to gain heritage funding, because as soon as you've got the potential to kind of negotiate an outcome with an owner because they're receiving financial or other kinds of support from council, that's where you could have that colour conversation. And it might also be mitigation for a consent that's got various elements, that some of which might be a little bit detrimental, but then you can say, but one of the mitigation proposals is going to be some consideration of colour. So I think there are opportunities for the council to intervene, but I think from a practical point of view, it's much better the building gets painted than it doesn't.
So my next one's 108. I can't remember what Commissioner Hovell said. It was 100 and something.
Yeah, no, I'm
after. Okay. So I'll get down there. I believe this is again a question for Dr. McEwen. It's where discussion of the ability to use land sort of outside of the protected item itself. And so I was trying to understand, is is the position that you've been putting forward, Dr. McEwen, in your analyses of the heritage items, where you've said you've made this point, you know, that there's no restrictions on the balance of the site, it doesn't affect the entire land parcel. Is that a intentional enabling response, similar to what you've just described, trying to enable, not be too restrictive?
Yeah, so if the heritage setting, for example, is limited to, say, 50% of a land parcel, then beyond that setting within the same parcel, then you would just be looking at the standard planning rules that would apply to, you know, whatever the underlying zoning is. In the case of R4, that's talking about new works within the setting. So that's why there is the ability to bring in that restricted discretionary if the permitted activity status is kind of breached, for want of a better word. And Heritage New Zealand was wanting to basically, regardless of the scale, was wanting to take out the provision for small, non-habitable structures, less than 10 square metres in area, 2 metres in height, etc., not visible from a public place. And it was my view that that provision in the rule was sufficiently specific that the potential impact on the heritage values of the item within its setting was going to be very minor in nature. And obviously this is only going to be applicable to some sites anyway, because if it's a house, then there's unlikely to be any room that you can put a 10 square metre building up to 2 metres in height that you can't see from a public place. But essentially it's again acknowledging that heritage sites, items and their settings have to be useful, have to function for the owners in order that they be maintained, and that something like a garage, for example, is quite to be expected, even if a villa in Gore was built before the owners were able to buy a car. So that's the intention. Yes, there's an element of pragmatism about that, but it's also thinking about the particular sites that might affect. And because we're talking about visibility from a public place, then I think that will ensure limited visual impact, which would be the primary concern with an additional building or structure.
And that takes us back then to Policy 6, which is at paragraph 103, where the words that are used in there talks about some small-scale buildings and structures. So, Tina, having regard to the rule, I'm just wondering whether those words which have been asked for by Heritage New Zealand should read small-scale, non-habitable buildings and structures.
Again, it's the policy is trying to kind of give the broad overview and the detail comes out in the rule. But yes, it's the small scale buildings and structures are the non-habitable ones. So that could be made clearer in the policy.
And
it is the policy is trying to just give the direction that these are the type of buildings that could be allowed for.
yes, just the word "some" gives rise to some uncertainty, which may not be desirable. The second part of Policy 6, to me, really, there's two policies. So you've got the first part, which is the first sentence that talks about enabling these things, and then the second part says manage other works. Can that be split into two policies? Or do an A and B?
It could be split out into two policies. I was trying to keep them anything that related to the city within the one policy, and that might be also, we've talked about earthworks previously, and if that should be split out, there might be a case to make that distinction clearer. The policy is kind of dealing with all those activities within the setting, whether it's land disturbance or structures. So it's bundling all of that together to have one policy for the setting, but it could be split out.
Yeah, paragraph 112, I've got a note here that the other members of the panel will probably need to look at. And in the summary of submissions, there is reference to infrastructure rules. And to me, what's included in the evidence for this hearing is almost resulting in a duplication, and one of the key issues in infrastructure is it a standalone chapter that needs to be worked through. So I'm just identifying that for other panel members as part of their deliberations. And the next one's 114, where Transpower, in terms of HH Rule 5, have suggested that where an archaeological authority is granted, then it should be a permitted activity. So Anne, I'm just wondering from your perspective whether that is something that's appropriate.
Sorry, Chair. So the question was whether it's appropriate to make a permitted activity if an archaeological authority has been granted. Is that correct?
Yes, it just removes the duplication of getting an authority and then coming to council to get a resource consent for exactly the same thing.
Right. I think in practice it's quite likely that there's going to be more going on than simply a potential modification, damage or destruction of an archaeological site. So I think in practice an applicant is going to have to apply for resource consent. Having gained an archaeological authority, they'll just be able to tick that box and move on to whatever else is going on as part of the proposal. So I'm not sure that it would kind of save anybody any time and kind of money if that were the case, because the place on which that authority is being sought might have other values, might have ecological or hazards or something else that is going to mean that the applicant has to show that those things have been considered to the council, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I understand where you're coming from. And where does the responsibility lie? No, that's fine, thank you.
Can I put it another way? Would from a historic heritage perspective and an archaeological perspective, there be anything missing if someone went and got their archaeological authority and then came with that, would there be anything else that the council consenting process would bring to that archaeological question?
I think in practice the number one thing would probably be consultation Ngāi Whenua, because that's not sometimes an archaeological report which is needed to lodge for an archaeological authority might not have included that consultation. And I guess the difficulty is trying to reconcile, because we've got those two pieces of legislation, the archaeological authority process is entirely captured and mandated by the Heritage New Zealand Poheri Taonga Act. And so, given that I'm not a planner, I'm not entirely sure how RMA processes can sort of simply parcel things off to another act. But I think there could be some things that fall through the gaps, and that would be the reason why basically that's where the position that an applicant is in. There are two pieces of legislation that manage protection of historic heritage resources, but also have a statutory process for damage, modification and destruction of archaeological sites. So unfortunately, I think there's no way of streamlining the fact that those two pieces of legislation are in the room.
And so then we have to think about the purpose of each piece of legislation and how that is managing the matter, yeah?
Okay, so paragraph 115 talks about rule HHR5, and 1C talks about temporary structures that are movable, and some examples are given: vehicles, trailers, caravan, boats. So the definition of structure that's in the Act is something that is fixed to the ground, and I couldn't understand a vehicle, a trailer, caravan or boat being included in the definition of structure. You could argue that a tent is fixed to the ground where there is tie lines down there. It's just that the examples given then do not fit within the definition of structure.
Yes, this has come up quite often in the past as well with can like a vehicle or a trailer be a structure. I would have to go back and relook at the definition of structure again, but there have been instances where, say, a caravan or a tiny home are movable but are fixed to land by the connection of services, for example. So there is a little bit of a contention in there. Yeah, I would have to go back and look at the definition of structure in full to be able to give you a full answer on that, I think. But just noting that there has been instances where caravans are deemed to be not vehicles but structures.
So I'm at paragraph 130, and what I was wondering is if reliance was going to be placed on the Tūtaro monument, which is scheduled to provide some level of protection, if these, you know, if it's taken off as an archaeological site. If it's just the monument, though, would that provide any protection beyond the monument?
Yeah, sure. So that's right. So we know that there is some record of that. There is potentially a village around this area, and the Schedule 2 item is the monument, which is obviously not a village, but it's likely that it could be in the vicinity of that village. So, and the setting for a monument is quite large. It includes the whole site. So that's where my comment is coming from. That there is some protection of the setting, but yes, that item is in relation to a monument, not a potential village.
I've also got questions about paragraph 130, but I'll wait until Chris Jennings is online before addressing those. So paragraph 132, the last sentence says any further restrictive changes to HHR5 should only be subsequent and could potentially be considered as a consequential change. A consequential change to what? Where else is this issue?
So if further technical archaeological assessments were undertaken that could define the extent of the archaeological sites more clearly, then a consequential change to the rule could be considered to make it more restrictive. It's that balance between, at the moment, we're trying to permit for the usability of the site, basically for the landowner, we're trying to permit low-risk activities that they might want to undertake. But the extent of the sites have not been assessed in some cases and defined. So if more technical work was undertaken to kind of narrow the sites down, then that could potentially be coupled with a more restrictive, that will remove some of the rule allowances because it becomes more usable for the landowner that site is smaller, basically. So it's that trying to find that balance between usability and protection.
But we don't have any such evidence, so we can't do any changes at this stage.
No, that's right. So it would have to, if the panel wasn't of mind of going down that path, then that's obviously part of the Heritage New Zealand recommendation. It would have to be subject to further technical work. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm not sure who will respond to this question, but a number of the submitters have requested their buildings be removed from the historic heritage listing. And a point that they've raised is the costs of maintaining and upgrading the building. And sometimes I see it happening around the town that these buildings are just left and they're derelict, and then that in itself is an issue for our district. I'm just wondering if I realise there is a Lotteries Heritage Fund, but it is quite restrictive. How do you expect these people to be able to keep these buildings upgraded and in good condition?
So, yeah, that's right. So the submitters in opposition, most of them, if not all, have raised the issue of the cost of maintaining a building. So part of the district plan has been to try and strike that balance and trying to help out by having quite permissive rule settings for those activities, that is maintenance, repairs, there wouldn't be an unnecessary cost. Council can also, outside of the district plan process as a non-regulatory support, have, assist with the cost of, say, resource consent, or have some sort of a grant structure or something like that to support those landowners. So there is other avenues that the council landowners, and that is also something that's come through quite strongly in submissions. There is that support for the non-regulatory support for landowners is valued quite highly.
And council has already resolved to waive fees on site, on buildings that are on the heritage list, where a consent is required. And is there anything that you can add from the cost point of view in terms of your experience? Is the inclusion on the register actually almost a disincentive in some cases to actually maintain buildings?
I don't think actually, if an owner doesn't want to maintain their property, I don't think it matters whether they're scheduled or not. We do have a reactive resource management kind of framework though in New Zealand, so essentially demolition by neglect is the way that some property owners kind of address the fact that they're scheduled. But even if a building is not scheduled and it's on the main street in Gore or Matara, there's nothing to say that an owner has to maintain it until you get to unsanitary and whatever the other word is for kind of going to call unsafe buildings. So there is a gap there, I think, at a kind of policy, national policy level as to how you actually get owners to kind of maintain things for the betterment of themselves and the community. Especially with buildings that aren't listed by Heritage New Zealand, being scheduled does create a formal recognition of heritage values that an owner can then use in support of an application for funding, whether that's from lotteries or a local community trust or with the council itself. So it does give the building or the structure standing, if you will, in order to establish that it merits that kind of assistance. And I think waiving resource consent fees, as the chair has just mentioned, is another way that council can acknowledge that there is a cost. These days, though, in my experience, the problem that we all face as building owners is insurance. So, you know, it's not being scheduled or not. It's kind of whether you can get insurance, what requirements are there. And I think that the plan has been written to, as Tina said, to be as cognizant as possible that owners are in a special position if they have a scheduled building and that they need to be able to kind of keep them going, both for their own benefit, but also because that's what maintains heritage value. But buildings cost money. If you own a building, you've got to maintain it. And I think sometimes people forget that that's what you would have to do if you own a building anyway, whether it's a scheduled heritage item or not.
I wondered what you know about the availability of heritage experts in the Gore district. Is there an issue with availability of that expertise and knowledge?
Well, I'm always available, and I think one of the ways that council can support all of the property owners that are on the district plan is to use the material that's been generated as part of this process in order to help owners understand why their building is significant, but also to perhaps provide the letter in support that can go with the funding application. So yes, potentially you're looking at costs of heritage experts if you have to pay them to be on site, you have to pay travel and so on. But getting good advice is not that costly. You just have to start from that point of view of dealing with the heritage building. And I think sometimes people might go to their local builder and say, oh, I've got an old building, it's on the district plan, what can we do? And then, oh, wow, it's going to be $1 million to replace that weatherboard. You know, you get a lot of misinformation, whereas sometimes people with some good advice at the front end can save money, can kind of stage a project, and being scheduled on the district plan again, I think some of the submitters had a misapprehension that it was going to tie the building up in cotton wool, that they couldn't kind of do anything, whereas in actual fact it's a reactive kind of process. If you want to demolish it, you're going to have to spend some money proving that it, you know, is a risk, or that it has no viable reuse. But otherwise, I think there is heritage expertise also with the Dunedin office of Heritage New Zealand. They're always happy to help property owners, even if they're not listed by them, because they are in the business of supporting districts to schedule items to protect them that way.
And so is this another part of the council's potential non-regulatory function, is that support and advice?
Yeah, I think so. And you've paid for a big resource now in terms of material about all of the buildings that are on the schedule. And so that material has already been funded, and it can be used to facilitate some of those non-regulatory support actions.
My last questions are for reporting officer. So, and they're really around the definitions. So when I look at, there's a definition included in the interpretation section of historic character, but I can't see it used in the chapter. And so I wanted to check whether there was any need for that definition.
Yeah, sure. So there is obviously the chapter, but there is also within the land use, within the zones, we have a number of precincts that support the Matara Centre and the Gore Centre. We talk about heritage character, which is more the look and feel of those main streets, basically. So that's where that term is from. That the character is more about the looks, whereas the heritage values is a bit more extensive than that.
Okay, so the fact that there's no link between use of the term in those zones and no use of the term in this chapter is not an issue?
Yes, so this chapter is more specifically about the scheduled buildings rather than the character of the streetscape. So that's where that term comes in. I can do a word search and make sure that it's not in this chapter. I don't think it is.
And then my last question is actually it's a big one. So it's relating to the fact that you've brought in the risk definition from the Building Act, and I could understand why you'd done that. But when I look at that, it's really narrow in terms of thinking about people, harm to people, risk of injury or death, and critical infrastructure, so those two things. But I'm seeing risk in the policies tied to people, buildings and property, so they're absent from the Building Act risk definition, and infrastructure more broadly, not just critical infrastructure. So I wondered if we potentially have an issue there. If you do bring that risk definition in, it's quite narrow, and it seemed to me that the policy direction was looking for something broader.
Yes, okay.
And then I wanted to following on from that thought, I wanted to swing back to the idea of significant risk. And my reason for doing that is, I guess the test of significance is one that we're quite used to in RMA setting. And one of the places where this is used, the very next item down is referencing significance in a different way. So I'm just going to get that up so I'm not talking... well, I'm trying to explain why that if we've got an issue with the definition of risk, why we might need to circle back to the idea of significant risk. And perhaps you could revisit that.
Yes.
And if you, when you do that, when you think about this, can you also look at where significance is signalled? Because it is used, but not in relation to risk.
Yes, that's correct. And we talk sometimes about the risk to an heritage item as well. So there's a risk to historic heritage, whereas the risk to people from a building is obviously something quite different.
Is it something you want to have a think about and come back at 1 o'clock?
Yeah, sure. So the wording of the definition sort of make it clear that it's the risk posed to people rather than the risk to heritage values. But I can certainly have another look at it.
I'm going to be asking this question of the telcos and Transpower when we see them too.
Yeah, that's all right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Tina, I have a question from page 39 of your report, 147. It's regarding the Southern Federated Farmers. They are concerned about property rights, and I see that you have said there are measures to minimise the obstruction of public access. What are those measures?
Just want to go up and have a look at the so if there is existing public access when to a heritage item or an archaeological site, if the site was to be subdivided, the site layout could, for example, obstruct that public access. So if, and it should be noted that, a lot of these sites don't have public access to it, so we're not trying to force that to be provided, but if there is already public access, and that's a matter of consideration. So it has to do with the lot layout and how that could be maintained for the public.
All right.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you, Tina.
Right. Do we have any further questions then of Dr. McEwen in terms of the statement that she's given? No. All right, so that brings us to the end of the consideration of the reports, and thank you for coming up online and for your input. So we will now move to consider the Section 42A report that deals with trees. And so we'll take it as read. Is there anything additional that you wish to add before we open it up for questions?
No, nothing additional, just that the supplementary evidence from Transpower was the only one received, and acknowledge in the supplementary information provided that Transpower was accepted my recommendations.
All right, open it up for questions.
I'm going to start at 42, and this might be for some expert assistance. I just wanted to understand if that 100 STEM score was the same as was used to schedule trees in the operative district plan. Do we know if that's the case?
Brad, are you able to confirm that it was? My understanding is that it was 100 that was used in the operative plan when the plan change was done in 2006 or thereabouts.
I think there is a range of abilities for trees in Marlborough to be accepted. One was that there is a threshold of 100, I believe. I could have just bear with me while I.
While we're waiting for him to come back up online, just he's back online.
Yeah, I'm back.
Right,
Yeah,
with
sorry
you.
about that. I clicked the wrong screen, so just bear with me because I've got Marlborough, how trees qualify in Marlborough, just here.
While he,
So Marlborough, it's 150 points, or a tree with a local notable attribute is how Marlborough qualified, from what I understand.
So you don't have knowledge about the operative Gore district plan and how those scheduled trees came to be on it?
Well, there's a range of scores that different municipalities around New Zealand use. For instance, Whangarei use a score of 100. Waipa use 110. Upper Hutt use 100 points. There are other districts that have a higher threshold. That helps.
the plan change information can easily be looked up, and I'll if the staff can do that and come back and confirm.
Yeah, I was going to say I can look into that for you, but my presumption was that Gore District Council chose a STEM threshold. I'm not sure for the operative district plan, but for the proposed district plan of 100, so we can look into the operative district plan for you.
Yeah, that was my main reason for asking. Is this a different setting than previously? That's really what I'm trying to work out. At your paragraph 65, where you've got the new definition of a tree protection zone, do we need the word means in there? I wondered if it could just start from the is.
Sorry, can you just repeat the paragraph there?
So it's paragraph 65, and it's your new wording for the definition of a tree protection zone.
You're saying take the first word out.
Yeah, the means. Brad might be able to explain this better, but this was the definition that was taken from the submission point and from the National Planning tree protection zone that we had. But if Brad wanted to comment on the word means in front of the tree protection zone.
Yes, thank you. Both expressions relate to exactly the same thing, except the tree protection zone has become more of an international standard rather than a root protection zone. So when you're defining an area around a tree that you want to protect during, say, development, it's about using an expression that has wide understanding as opposed to just in Gore referring to the root protection zone. Does that answer the question?
Thank you, that's helpful. Yeah. So paragraph 79, there's some discussion about trees that have been removed, and I just wanted to understand, was this a failure of the operative plan that you're signalling, or was it sort of an illegal act in relation to the existing plan?
Yeah, so there were 6 trees that we identified had been removed, and it was under both the operative district plan and the proposed district plan. 3 of the trees were listed under the operative district plan, and a couple of the trees were listed only under the proposed district plan. So it's obviously something that's happened in between both of them, and it's really unclear if it was just the lack of people not understanding the rules under the operative district plan or not being aware when the new rules of the proposed district plan also came in. But most of the trees were under the operative district plan and therefore were illegal kind of things. But obviously that's being looked outside of the district plan and through regulatory functions.
I'm wondering whether to help minimise future occurrences, the council might like to give some thought to when there is a change in ownership of a property, and council is notified of the change of ownership, and it's something that's done by other councils, of actually having a little dossier of information to send to the new landowner where a property is subject to explicit district plan provisions, like you're living on a site now that has a protected tree, you're on a site that has a heritage building on it, things like that. Do you think something like that would be worthwhile?
As you can imagine, that obviously it's really hard to keep a track of change of ownership in the district, and the only means that we know of it coming through is if a LIM, I can't actually think of what that stands for, a LIM request is asked for by the council, which is when we were able to give the planning provisions of the overlays that fall onto that property. So that's a means that council can actually indicate to new owners that if there's any heritage or notable trees lying on that property.
That's prior to the sale taking place, but when there's a new owner, council's rating information is increased. So I would have thought that there's an opportunity when the rating department's advised of a new landowner, they let the planning department know.
Yeah, so that's true. The rating department obviously does get a notice when a new property comes in, and then there could be potential for the rating department and the planning department to talk about letting the new owners know of the planning provisions that overlie.
I'm just wondering if it could be treated like a QE2 covenant, where it's listed on the title. They are, though,
Yeah, the covenant.
which makes it, yeah, we can talk.
Oh, I was going to say my understanding is that it's just under the proposed district plan, so I don't think that they can be moved on to covenants on the titles, just because they're only rules relating to the district plan there.
If I might add, some local authorities put a simple plaque on each of their trees, and that seems to certainly reduce the risk of trees being removed when new owners take on the property. It's quite clear that there's a tree's protected.
Thanks, Brad. That's a good idea. What does the planner think of that one?
No, I do agree. It's a really good idea.
All you need is for council to allocate a budget.
And that's obviously council's decision to make.
So I've got a question at paragraph 84, and it was really around the sycamore and the assessment. You know, so Environment Southland have raised a question about these 3 trees, 2 silver birches and a sycamore, and I could see some reliance on Mr. Cadwallader's assessment around the sycamore tree not causing a visible problem with tree spread. What I wanted to understand was, thinking about the seed dispersal range of a sycamore, how extensive was the assessment in terms of distance from the tree to be certain that it wasn't a propagation source?
Well, certainly in some locations I've seen sycamores to be a weed issue, but in the immediate area where these trees were, the trees that have been identified, which are part of groups as opposed to individual trees, I didn't see any weeding, any self-sown trees popping up in the immediate area. For instance, a triangle, that area is highly maintained, and there are no other sycamores that were growing in that immediate area. But you're quite correct that sycamore seeds can travel some distance. But in urban environments, it's quite difficult for sycamores or any weed tree to take root in highly urbanized environments, whereas in a, say for instance, an abandoned lot, if there was a sycamore tree on the frontage of an abandoned lot, then those seeds would take hold quite readily because the lot's not being mown.
And what would you understand the seed dispersal range to be for a sycamore?
Do I understand what the dispersal range is?
Yeah, just how far they can travel. Yeah.
They're quite heavy seeds, but I guess it depends on the wind. But I could imagine that they could travel for hundreds of kilometres, hundreds of metres.
So we're not talking kilometres. You're talking more hundreds of metres.
Yeah, and I can attest that at the bottom of my property, I've removed over 200 sycamore seedlings of less than 100 millimetres in height, and they're up to about 100 metres away from the trees themselves.
In a water environment, if you had them along, say, growing beside a river, then I guess they could be taken downstream, but generally they're a wind-dispersed seed and they're quite heavy, so they tend to fall fairly quickly.
I just have a question, Brad, about the silver birch trees. We recently had some removed from in our district because of health issues. They were causing asthma and breathing problems for some of the people that were using the facility. Do you have any comment about that? I was just referring to the birch trees that you suggested should not be removed.
I was actually asked to look into a case in Gore with the previous parks manager where people were complaining about birch allergy, and during the investigation it was found that the period of time that the complainants were relating their issue was not at the time when the birch were producing pollen, but at a time when they were distributing their seed. So the people were assuming that the seed that was being blown hither around their properties was pollen, and the complainants also didn't get tested to make some sort of connection between their allergy problem and birch. Often birch are the whipping tree when it comes to identifying allergies, but there's many trees that produce pollen, like our totara, that is allergenic. So perhaps the two most troublesome pollen sources is grass and fungal spores from trees that cause most allergies. So I'm not sure birch themselves, are the sole source of people's allergy problems.
Thank you.
You mentioned thunder spores, was it?
Yeah, fungal spores that
I heard it as thunder, as in lightning and thunder, not fungal. Thank you.
I wanted to understand if the STEM method would identify weedy species as part of an assessment. Because I think we've got an analysis that suggests that the matter of weediness would present itself through a STEM assessment, but when I look at those assessment items, I couldn't see where it would come in, so I wanted to understand if that would routinely happen.
The STEM does take note of nuisance issues, and so a tree might be rated low in one or two criteria, but generally the tree would have to have some sort of significance beyond just the fact that it might present a weeding issue. I mean, every tree produces seed to an extent. It's whether that seed then takes hold. So the assessment, while it does look at nuisance factors, I think the overriding criteria that the methodology is focusing on is actually the significance of the tree. Although, as I say, I'm not saying that being a weed tree is discounted completely.
And so that's, I think you've answered my question, because what you've suggested to me is that the assessment is taking a different focus, and so this would be sort of a peripheral element to the main focus of the assessment. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. There might be some trees that might be passed over simply because they are a terrible weed species. I'm just trying to think of...
Willow.
Yeah, in some environments, for instance, Walding pines, in some environments, you might have a very important heritage. Say, for instance, there was a tree, planted in the 1890s, and it was a Pinus radiata tree in a particular environment. It's quite difficult to offset, the fact that you've got, on the one hand, this heritage tree that was planted by a particular person or to commemorate a certain event. And on the other hand, that it produces seed that could be become a weed problem. So it's really weighing up those and looking at that environment and understanding whether the tree is indeed being a nuisance in that particular environment. So do take those sorts of situations into consideration when we are assessing a tree.
So this is actually for this reporting officer who's just disappeared. Because I've been trying to grapple with this question, having a look at the DOC list of weed species in New Zealand, and the one from 2024, and these two species are listed on that DOC list, and wondering about how looking higher up the chain, I ended up back at part 2 of the RMA, and I also ended up at section 75, where it's directing to look at plans and strategies developed under other acts. I've been trying to grapple with the idea of whether protecting a weed species in a plan is consistent with section 5B.
Perfect. So on the
Oh,
reporting
I'm sorry, I'm looking at the wrong person.
You're all good. I took it all in. So the regional, Southland Regional Policy Statement is our overarching thing, and I'd have to look into it further to actually see in regards to mention of weedy trees or anything. But there's the overarching things of recognising heritage, the objects with heritage values. But in regards to the 2 trees that were listed on the Environment Southland website, they weren't an overarching plan. They were more just a general identification of what I understood of just trees that were identified as weedy, known as weedy species.
Yes, and I think that's what I understood as well, like a general propensity to be weedy. And so then is the reliance being placed on this idea of yes, but not weedy in this environment? Is that how we should read this?
Yeah, and I think Brad really identified it before, is that obviously these species are known to be weedy, but it does depend on the environment that they're located in, and the ones that have been identified in our plan are being identified to be in a well-maintained and looked after environment, and not somewhere close to, i.e. like a river bank or anything.
And if I just might add that, you know, it's about looking at individual trees as opposed to species. So I do acknowledge that some species, the whole group of trees, can be a weed, can be considered to be a weed. But STEM looks at individuals in their context as to the significance they bring to a community, and I would take into consideration if a tree was being a particular nuisance in that area as to whether it was a worthy of protection, and so in that case the weediness might trump the fact that it's an important tree.
That's really helped me this conversation. I was struggling with the idea. Paragraph 100 in relation to tree P1, where you've made some change in response to the submission from Hokanui. I wondered if we have lost something in the recommendation. So that what's been crossed out is expertise, and I wondered if we might need a blend of what's been crossed out and what's been added in. So I'll just...
And to help, I'm wondering whether, and I picked up the same, so it talks about using STEM or where relevant mana whenua. I think the word should be and. Because under the STEM analysis, one of the things taken into account is cultural values.
So which paragraph, sorry?
It shows up as 103. In the original version's at the top of the page of 22 of paragraph 97 in terms of what was being asked for.
Yeah, perfect. I agree with you adding the and in. I do apologise that obviously in the assessment has been lost the track changes for what was taken out of the multicultural expert and replaced with manawa whenua representative. But I do agree that having the and after the STEM to read for the STEM assessment and or where relevant manawa whenua representative would read better.
I also wondered if it should say a mana whenua representative with cultural expertise. And my reason for saying that is I've had experience working for mana whenua, so I've been in a place where I'm in some respects representing, but not with cultural expertise. So I do wonder if that's a valuable addition. So that would pick up cultural expert, which has been crossed out, and we'd have a mana whenua representative with cultural expertise.
Can I just make a suggestion that could read paragraph 103, that it could read in consultation with mana whenua, a mana whenua representative? Because you want to use STEM methodology, but you want to ensure engagement with mana whenua.
Going back on your adding with the culture expertise, I do agree that that probably would be a nice way to kind of summarise and help identify different people having obviously different expertise, and it would align with the objectives to acknowledge that there's cultural values of the trees that are be recognised appropriately.
So Brad is also suggesting that the word "and" now be replaced in consultation where relevant.
Yeah, my understanding of the STEM assessments, and Brad obviously is aware of how they work, is that they are undertaken in consultation with all parties relevant. It could be landowners as well as the mana whenua. So yeah, it kind of achieves the same thing. It's just not written in words, because there was actually a submission in there from a couple of submitters asking for to consult with landowners, and we rejected to remove that, the words "to consult with," just because we thought that policy 1 actually achieved the wording of consultation, although it doesn't actually say it. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I have more questions. So at 101, I wondered if while this has been directed at P1, so this idea of landowner consultation that you were just talking about, is this also partly to do with application of Policy 7?
I suppose the submission that was provided was quite broad, and they kind of only referred to tree P1 in that instance, and so there was no indication of tree policy 7, but I think tree policy 7 is quite broad in itself, that providing education and advice can come from quite a few different instances and can be implemented and consulted with parties throughout different phases.
And would it be perhaps Policy 7 that provides a link to that non-regulatory conversation that we had around different ways that the council might give effect to that policy?
Yeah, it does.
So the same issue that I raised previously around adopting this Building Act definition of risk, I think is even more acute when we're thinking about the notable trees, because and when we're thinking about the electricity hazards from trees regulations. So it seems the intent is to capture risks to people, buildings, property and infrastructure. The Building Act definition is extremely narrow in terms of what it's thinking about, and the regulations actually do point to property, people and property, so they do pick up property. So I would see use of the Building Act definition might be at odds with the regulations, but it also might be at odds with what is trying to be achieved. So similar to my question previously around the historic heritage chapter, should we be having another look at this idea of significant risk? And I guess my reason for asking that question is that significance is a common test in RMA circles, and we might be thinking about the difference between something that is minor or less than minor or more than minor / significant, and just have another think about the best way to address this issue which is being raised by Transpower, particularly in this case.
So should we have that conversation with Transpower in the room?
Yeah, definitely we will, definitely. But have a think about how we might address it.
Yep, thank you, I will do.
If I could just interrupt there as well, I think that definitely that is a point that we need to look into also in combination with the historic heritage chapter, so that we've got consistency between the two. Heritage New Zealand actually put forward the use of the definition from the Building Act, so if the panel feels so inclined, I think it would be useful to bring it up with them as well in terms of their experience of how it is utilised, and if there is potentially a gap in terms of the buildings and other infrastructure that's not critical. But I imagine, based on once we've worked our way through the submitters and had good discussions here today, that it might be useful to bring up this point in a minute that we can then have a right of reply on.
Or potentially some conferencing.
Or conferencing, yes.
That's me.
I have a question on page 1889, and it's regarding the 75 millimetre in diameter trimming of branches, and I'm just without the requirement for a resource consent, and I'm just thinking about the notable trees up Hokanui Drive, where they were trimmed by an operator, and really it has, I'm not an expert, but in my view it's actually affected the integrity of all those trees because they've been cut on one side to alleviate the issues with the power lines. So I was wondering if Brad would like to comment on the 75 millimetre cut for branches of trees without consent.
I guess this just allows a minimum that people, as a permitted activity, they can do minor works. That's what I'm understanding. So are these cuts that you speak of, I'm not aware of the situation, but are these cuts that you're speaking larger than 75 mil?
Yes.
So they weren't.
They would be.
Yes. They should have had a consent.
They actually, yes, they should have been consented.
Yeah, so I think what Brad's trying to say is that any trees that it's the maximum width of in diameter of 75 millimetres would be permitted under the proposed district plan, which now obviously has legal effect as well. Past trimming, and I think this is what this rule was trying to achieve, is to ensure that past trimming that's undertaking of trees can actually affect the amenity and values of the trees. And as you have highlighted, that the ones down Hokanui Drive have kind of been butchered for some better words, and that has affected, as people can see, the amenity values of it. So by having these rules in place, it still allows the freedom of people to maintain the trees, but still keeping with the amenity values, achieving the objectives and policies.
So there appear to be no further questions. So thank you for Bridget and Brad. Our next person is turning up at 11 o'clock, so we shall adjourn for 10 minutes and have a brief comfort stop for everybody and reconvene just after 11. Thank you.